The sound of my sister Paige's heels on the oak floor of our mother's lake house felt like a countdown I couldn't stop. I was down on my knees, pinning the hem of the ivory bridesmaid dress she'd wear to her engagement party that evening. My hands shook, not from the cold coming off the Minnesota lake, but from 10 years of being the one who cleaned up everyone else's mess. Before we continue, remember that this is still a small channel, and I could really use your support. Please like the video and subscribe. It's free and it helps more than you know. My name is Cora Ellison. For as long as I could remember, I was the quiet one. The daughter who made the grocery runs, typed my sister's college essays, and stood behind the camera at every family reunion. Our father ran a small but profitable hardware distribution company out of Rochester. When he died, his will left the business and the old family cabin on Lake Pepin to both of us, but my mother, Darlene, took one look at me in my worn cardigan and said I wasn't fit to handle money. She moved the shares into a trust she controlled and told me I should be grateful just to have a roof and a bed. I believed her. I said sorry when I spoke, and I smiled when my chest felt like it was filling with ash. That afternoon, while I was ironing Paige's dress, a cream envelope slipped from her purse. It was an invitation to a private dinner hosted by the Bowen Group, a logistics empire based in the Twin Cities. The name on the invite wasn't Paige's. It was mine. When I asked Darlene about it, the room went still. She gave me a thin smile and said a man named Garrett Bowen needed a quiet wife on paper, someone who wouldn't cause scenes or talk to the press. She'd already promised me to him in exchange for wiping out the debt from Paige's failed boutique in Stillwater. I was being handed off like a piece of furniture to a stranger so they could keep their lifestyles. But they forgot one thing. A person pushed into a corner learns how to stand. The drive to Garrett's estate near Wayzata was silent. I carried a small canvas bag and a silver thimble that belonged to my grandmother. It was the only thing Darlene hadn't sold at the church rummage sale. When we arrived, the glass and stone house overlooked the water, and Garrett stood in the doorway like a man used to being obeyed. He was broad, with grey eyes, and a calm that felt like pressure. He didn't say welcome. He looked at the thimble on my coat and said I was exactly what he expected, someone who kept her head down. For the first week, I ate alone at a long table while the house staff watched with pity. Darlene and Paige called every day, not to ask if I was okay, but to check if the wire transfers had cleared. On a rainy Tuesday, Garrett was in the study trying to repair an old grandfather clock that had stopped. He kept misaligning the pendulum, and his jaw tightened with each failed try. Without thinking, I stepped in and said the weight on the swing arm was off by a quarter inch. The quiet after that felt heavy. He turned and asked who I thought I was. I said I was the woman they sold, but a clock doesn't care about deals, only balance. Something shifted in his face. He stepped back and told me to fix it. When the ticking started, he wasn't looking at the clock. He was looking at me. The real trouble began at the investor reception in downtown Minneapolis. Darlene and Paige showed up uninvited, wearing dresses that looked borrowed and jewels that screamed panic. They told the room how I used to cry over split milk and how I never finished nursing school. Paige knocked a glass of red wine down my blue dress on purpose, waiting for me to run. I felt the old shame climb my neck. Then I looked at the thimble on my lapel. Garrett was watching from across the room, glass in hand, waiting to see if I'd stay a shadow. I picked up a cup of water from the tray and poured it slow over Paige's arm. I said if she wanted attention, she'd earned a reason to clean herself up. Darlene screamed that I was ungrateful. Garrett walked to the center and put his hand on my shoulder. He told the room I wasn't a placeholder, but the new head of community programs for his foundation. He said, a person's worth shows when they're around people who can give them nothing. The win didn't last. The next morning, a photo of me with a high school boyfriend appeared online with claims I was routing Bowen funds to him. It was built by Paige and a junior accountant named Todd, who feared my rising role. The transfers had my digital signature. Garrett called me to his office. He dropped the papers on the desk and asked what I had to say. I didn't cry. I asked him to check the timestamps. The moves were made while I was with him in the study with the clock. I said if he wanted to believe a lie, that was his fear, not my flaw. I turned to leave, ready to go back to nothing. He stopped me and said he already knew it was fake. He'd traced Todd's laptop before he ever called me in. He wanted to see if I'd fight for myself. He said his whole life people said yes to his money, but no one had ever corrected him or stood to walk. He handed me a folder. Inside were the deeds and shares Darlene had locked away, now mine by court order. He said I didn't need him to be strong, but he needed me to be real. The true test came when a fire broke out at the youth shelter his group funded in St. Paul. Someone had set it to smear his name. While his security team argued about liability, I ran to the back wing where 2 kids with asthma were locked in quarantine. I got them out, hands black with soot, but the thimble slipped from my coat in the hall and was gone in the rubble. A week later, Darlene and Paige filed suit in Ramsey County Court, claiming false imprisonment and demanding a settlement. They walked in smiling for the cameras. The judge let me speak. I played the mansion security footage showing Paige bragging about the photo setup to Todd. I laid out the bank records proving they'd taken my inheritance for years. They left in cuffs for fraud and perjury, while the cameras they loved captured it all. Later, in the garden behind the Wayzata house, Garrett handed me something small. He'd gone to the shelter ruins and found the thimble bent but whole. He said it used to mean what I'd lost. Now it meant I'd walked through fire and stayed standing. I looked out at the lake and felt the weight lift. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was the one who decided where the light went. The worst part wasn't the wine on the dress or the lie in the paper. It was the day I found the letter my mother had signed the week after Dad's funeral. I was cleaning the cabin attic in Lake City, going through a box of his old flannel shirts, when a manila envelope fell behind a loose floorboard. The ink was Darlene's careful slant. It was her agreement with a Rochester attorney, dated 6 days after the will was read, stating she would transfer the hardware company voting rights to Paige alone by claiming I had a learning disability that made me unable to manage funds. She'd forged a note from a school counselor saying I'd repeated 3rd grade, which was a lie. I read it on the dusty attic floor while the wind pushed the lake smell through the window. My first thought was not anger. It was a strange calm, like the floor had stopped moving. I took the letter and walked to the county recorder's office before it closed. The clerk, a woman with a name tag that read Bev, squinted at the date and said the signature looked off from the will file. I asked her to make a copy and stamp it received. She did. That copy became the second pillar of the case I would build, not the one Garrett's team led, but my own. 2 days later, Paige called the estate line. She said Mom was sick with worry, and if I just signed a release, Garrett would up my allowance. I held the phone and said no, then hung up. Darlene left a voicemail screaming that I was tearing the family apart. I played it for Garrett that night. He listened, then said the family was already apart before I arrived. That was the first time I slept without checking the lock on my bedroom door. The community programs job wasn't a title. Garrett put me in a borrowed office above a coffee shop on Grand Avenue and told me to figure out where the shelter money actually went. I found the trail in a week. Todd had been skimming from 3 nonprofits and routing it through a bait shop in Red Wing owned by his cousin. I drove there myself on a Saturday, parked by the river, and walked in. The cousin, a red-faced man named Gus, tried to wave me off. I set the printouts on the counter and said the Bowen name wasn't on this, but mine was now, and I'd be at the St. Paul police station by noon if he didn't confirm the transfers in writing. He signed. That sheet joined the attic letter and the video in my folder. At the court hearing, Darlene's attorney tried to say I was coerced by Garrett. I stood and said the only coercion was from the woman who raised me to say sorry for breathing. I handed the judge the attic letter, the Red Wing confirmation, and the footage of Paige. The gallery was full of people who'd known our family at the lake. None of them looked at Darlene when she was led out. After the hearing, Garrett and I drove to the cabin. We stood on the sagging dock where Dad used to teach me to cast. Garrett took the thimble from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. He said he'd been surrounded by yes people since he was 23, and he'd almost married one until she ran with his cousin. He said I was the first person who poured water on a bully instead of crying. I told him the thimble was bent, and he said that was fine. It proved it had been through something. The hardware company shares transferred to me the following month. I kept the Rochester warehouse open and gave the front office job to Bev's nephew, who'd been out of work since the plant closed. Paige's boutique debt was called by the bank, and Darlene moved into a senior apartment in Owatonna, paid by the court restitution she owed me. I don't visit. I sent the thimble to a jeweler in Stillwater who straightened it and put a tiny sapphire where the dent was. It sits on my desk now, next to the framed copy of the recorder's stamp. The last thing I did was write a letter to the judge, thanking him for the hearing, but saying I didn't want the shelter rebuilt under Bowen. I wanted it run by the 2 kids I pulled out, now teenagers, and a local nurse named Wanda. Garrett agreed. He said the empire felt lighter when someone told him no. I told him the lake felt lighter too. If you ever feel like the quiet one in the room, remember the thimble wasn't worth much until it went through fire. The love of a good man wasn't my rescue. It was the receipt for finally standing up. I set the thimble back on my desk next to the framed stamp, the sapphire catching the late afternoon light from the window that faced the lake. The phone rang an hour later. It was Wanda, the nurse from the shelter. She said the 2 kids, Marcus and Eleanor, had finished their asthma treatments and wanted to see me. I drove to the temporary housing unit on the edge of St. Paul, a converted church with a tin roof that smelled like rain. Marcus handed me a drawing of the cabin with a crooked thimble in the corner. He said he found it in his pocket when I got them out. I held it and felt the weight of a promise. Garrett was at the Rochester warehouse the next morning when I walked in. He was looking at the shipping logs, but he turned when he heard my step. He said the board wanted to expand into Iowa, but he'd told them no until the shelter was rebuilt. I said the shelter didn't need rebuilding now, it needed a bakery on the first floor for job training. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head, then laughed and said, fine, I should draft the proposal. I did, on the warehouse desk with a pen that had ink on the cap. Darlene's lawyer called to offer a settlement on the restitution. I told him I'd accept the payments as long as they came with a letter of apology signed by both my mother and sister. He said, that wasn't standard. I said neither was selling your daughter. The letter arrived a week later, typed on Paige's old boutique letterhead. It said they were sorry for the trouble. It didn't say for what, but I framed it anyway, next to the thimble. I go back to the cabin every month now, not to clean or organize, but to sit on the dock with a coffee and listen to the water. Garrett comes sometimes, but mostly I go alone. The quiet doesn't feel like weight anymore. It feels like room to breathe. The hardware company hired 3 new people from the shelter program. I walk through the warehouse and see them working, and I remember the way the attic letter felt in my hand. The thimble is worth more now than any deed I could name. It tells me that the fire didn't take me. It showed me what I was made of. That's the whole story. There's no grand moment of forgiveness or revenge. There's just a woman who learned to stop being sorry for the space she occupies. And that's enough.